From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
Bradley Manning's alleged disclosures have exposed war crimes, sparked revolutions, and induced democratic reform. He is the quintessential whistleblower.
In a U.S. broadcast exclusive, WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange responds to the verdict of Army whistleblower Bradley Manning, acquitted of aiding the enemy, but found guilty of violating the Espionage Act and other charges. Manning now faces up to 136 years in prison for leaking hundreds of thousands of secret documents to WikiLeaks. Julian Assange will join us from the Ecuadorian embassy in London, where he's been living for more than a year. Then we go to Fort Meade, Maryland, where Manning's sentencing hearing begins today. We'll speak with independent journalist Alexa O'Brien, who's been reporting from the courtroom every day since the trial began.
We're not talking about just merely the trial of Bradley Manning, as important as it is. We're talking about setting legal precedent for the future of national security reporting and also whistleblowers. And also, really, even beyond that, just simply people using the internet communicating in legally protected speech, First Amendment rights.
All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The sentencing hearing for Army whistleblower Bradley Manning begins today following his acquittal on the most serious charge he faced, aiding the enemy, but conviction on 20 other counts. On Tuesday, Manning was found guilty of violating the Espionage Act and other charges for leaking hundreds of thousands of government documents to WikiLeaks. In beating the aiding the enemy charge, Manning avoids an automatic life sentence, but he still faces a maximum 136 years in prison on the remaining counts. The sentencing phase is expected to last at least a week, with more than 20 witnesses set to appear. We'll have more on the Bradley Manning verdict with WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange after headlines. The Senate Judiciary Committee is holding its first hearing today on the government surveillance operations exposed by whistleblower Edward Snowden. Top officials from the Justice Department and the National Security Agency are expected to testify. The journalist who's published the bulk of Snowden's revelations, Glenn Greenwald of The Guardian, was due to testify by video link to a separate hearing in the House, but the panel was canceled after President Obama scheduled a meeting with House Democrats. On Tuesday, Democratic Senator Ron Wyden said the NSA has committed more serious violations of existing limits on spying than the government has disclosed. Speaking to MSNBC's Andrea Mitchell, Senator Wyden said his concerns came on top of a recent admission from National Intelligence Director James Clapper over violations of court orders.
They did say last Friday that there had been violations of those court orders with respect to the bulk phone record collection. So that's on the record. I'll tell you those violations are more serious than they stated.
Wyden has been unable to explain his concerns in detail because the surveillance operations are classified. On Friday, James Clapper sent Wyden a letter admitting, quote, a number of compliance problems with the bulk of collection of U.S. phone data, but said there were no findings of any intentional or bad faith violations. Clapper has previously apologized for falsely telling Wyden during a March hearing the NSA does not wittingly collect data on millions of Americans. On the eve of 2 days Senate hearing, U.S. intelligence agencies said they would declassify more information about NSA surveillance operations, including the order disclosed by Edward Snowden that orders Verizon to hand over all phone records. The announcement follows polls showing increased public skepticism of government surveillance and last week's narrow House defeat of a measure to block the bulk collection of data on all phone calls placed in the United States. A federal appeals court ruled law enforcement agencies can obtain location data on U.S. cell phone users without a warrant. In a 2-to-1 decision, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit upheld the practice of seizing the location data of phone calls from major telecoms, even with no court order. The court's majority okayed the practice on the grounds location data is a business record and therefore not protected by the Fourth Amendment right to privacy. A report last year from the ACLU found just a fraction of more than 200 police departments that admitted to tracking cell phones routinely obtained warrants. The tracking is said to be so commonplace that cellular providers are providing police with manuals outlining the range of data they store and the pricing for police to obtain it. Catherine Crump, an ACLU attorney, called the ruling, quote, a big deal and a big blow to Americans' privacy rights. President Obama is calling on Republicans to accept a new grand bargain aimed at reviving economic opportunities for the middle class. Speaking in Tennessee, Obama offered to cut the corporate tax in return for new government programs to create jobs.
So, here's the bottom line. If folks in Washington really want a grand bargain, how about a grand bargain for middle-class jobs? How about a grand bargain for middle-class jobs? And here's the bottom line. I'm willing to work with Republicans on reforming our corporate tax code as long as we use the money from transitioning to a simpler tax system for a significant investment in creating middle-class jobs. That's the deal.
President Obama's comments come as part of a new White House effort billed as an attempt to take on widening U.S. inequality. In an interview with the New York Times, Obama said, quote, "If we don't do anything, income equality will continue to rise. That's not a future we should accept," he said. The first full session of renewed Middle East peace talks was held Tuesday in Washington, D.C. Israeli and Palestinian negotiators agreed to meet within 2 weeks as part of a 9-month timetable to reach a comprehensive agreement. Secretary of State John Kerry said the parties have agreed to address the core issues behind the Israel-Palestine conflict.
The parties have agreed here today that all of the final status issues, all of the core issues, and all other issues are all on the table for negotiation. And they are on the table with one simple goal, a view to ending the conflict, ending the claims. Our objective will be to achieve a final status agreement over the course of the next 9 months. A viable two-state solution is the only way this conflict can end, and there is not much time to achieve it, and there is no other alternative.
As the talks were held, a new report from the Israeli group Peace Now said the Israeli settlement population in the occupied West Bank has grown more than twice as fast as Israel proper in the last 3 years. Peace Now activist Lior Amichai said the Israeli government has continued to encourage migration to the settlements.
The growth in the settlements is much higher than the annual growth inside Israel. In the West Bank settlements, we're talking about a 5% growth in population each year, much higher than the 2% or less than 2% inside Israel proper. This shows that the Israeli government is encouraging Israeli citizens to move and immigrate into the West Bank settlements, despite perhaps what some would say Israel's intentions for a two-state solution, or the government of Israel.
The United Nations says mounting violence in Syria has prevented the delivery of food to around 600,000 people. A spokesperson for the World Food Program said UN aid had only reached 2.4 million out of 3 million Syrians in need.
More areas are becoming inaccessible due to increased fighting. WFP planned to reach 3 million people in July, but the upsurge of violence across many areas in Damascus and Homs and the proliferation of checkpoints on the roads around major cities are affecting the pace of food dispatches. WFP has dispatched food for 2.4 million people, short of the July goal, which is the goal is 3 million people.
President Obama has asked Republican Senators Lindsey Graham and John McCain to travel to Egypt for talks with the interim government and opposition figures. The announcement follows Tuesday's meeting between European Union Foreign Policy Chief Catherine Ashton and the ousted Egyptian President Mohamed Morsi. It was Morsi's first known outside context since he was removed from office earlier this month. Later in the day, Ashton met with Egyptian Vice President Mohamed El-Baradei.
Only an inclusive process will work, and though I recognise that is challenging, it is really important to begin now.
To end polarization through peaceful means, and that's exactly what we are trying to do. That's exactly why Lady Ashton and the European Union has been here to try to help. That's why we are having all sorts of conversation with everybody. So I'm still optimistic. I still hope once we lower the temperature, once we contain, the violence that is taking place, then there will be room for a peaceful way to disband demonstration in different parts of the country and then go into a serious dialogue.
You can go to our website at democracynow.org for our interview with Democracy Now!'s Sharif Abdel-Quddus from Cairo. The financial giant J.P. Morgan is paying a $410 million fine for driving up energy prices in California and the Midwest. J.P. Morgan agreed to the penalty without admitting to government allegations it manipulated utilities to raise the price of electricity. It's the largest settlement in the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission's history. The British firm Barclays has been hit with a similar fine but is refusing to pay. J.P. Morgan is facing a more expensive government penalty for its role in pushing toxic mortgage-backed securities. According to the New York Times, the firm is currently under investigation from 8 different federal regulators. MIT's released a long-awaited report on its handling of the prosecution of Aaron Swartz, the internet freedom activist who committed suicide in January. Swartz took his own life weeks before he was set to go on trial for using MIT's network to download millions of articles provided by the nonprofit research service JSTOR. He was facing 35 years in prison, a penalty supporters called excessively harsh. The MIT review concludes the school remained neutral in the prosecution of Swartz, but adds it failed to, quote, duly take into account the wider background of information policy against which the prosecution played out and in which MIT people have traditionally been passionate leaders, unquote. Friends and colleagues of Aaron Swartz have denounced the report as a whitewash. Ben Wilker, who co-founded the radio show Flaming Sword of Justice with Aaron Swartz, spoke to Democracy Now! Tuesday.
Now, what MIT had concluded, I got angry. MIT promised to, investigate the full facts of the case. Somehow it's decided that it was neutral throughout, and the MIT president said that their actions were reasonable and in good faith and appropriate. In fact, MIT was working with the prosecution and stonewalling the defense, as people who were close to Aaron know. So this is really just a whitewash, and it's disappointing and frankly makes me furious.
Aaron Swartz's attorneys have filed an ethics complaint against federal prosecutors, saying they withheld exculpatory evidence. The Drug Enforcement Administration has agreed to pay a $4.1 million settlement to a San Diego college student who nearly lost his life after being left handcuffed in a cell for more than 4 days without food or water. Daniel Chung had been arrested at a 420 celebration of marijuana culture. He was not charged with any crime and was due to be released. But instead, the DEA says agents forgot about Chung after placing him inside a holding cell in handcuffs. Chung says he could hear DEA staffers outside his cell, but no one answered his pleas for help. He drank his own urine in a bid to survive before finally being found just as he says he felt his life slipping away. None of the agents involved will face charges. And 6 activists with the group Code Pink were arrested inside the Senate Hart building on Tuesday for a protest calling for the closure of Guantanamo Bay. 3 of the demonstrators are currently on a long-term hunger strike in solidarity with hunger-striking Guantanamo prisoners. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Nermeen Sheikh. Welcome to our listeners and viewers around the country and